Good evening. This is Thursday, October 12th, 26 days until the 2006 midterm elections. Just get me a effing faith-based thing. 8 words attributed to Karl Rove by author and former special assistant to the president, David Quo. They could, by themselves, very well decide those midterms. Our fifth story in the countdown, part 2 of our look inside Mr. Quo's extraordinary new book, Tempting Faith, written from his earlier vantage point as the number 2 man in Bush's Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. And though it's a very large tip, the Rove quote is just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. As we reported last night, Mr. Quo is making several explosive claims, among them that behind their backs the nation's top evangelical Christians were regarded with routine mockery and contempt by White House staffers, called nuts and ridiculous. We also told you that Quo writes that the faith-based office was so starved for support from the Oval Office that it was forced to transform itself into a political arm of Republican campaign efforts. David Quo is himself a self-described conservative Christian. His personal and his religious assessment of Mr. Bush is nowhere near the most newsworthy of Quo's revelations in our report tonight, but it might be a valuable key to understanding this president.
When you accept Christ as a Savior, it changes your heart.
To this day, Quo writes, he believes Mr. Bush loves Jesus, that he is a good man. However, Quo also writes many Christians assume from his belief in Jesus Christ that Bush won't do what other politicians do, break their word, hide their mistakes, spin the truth, and that those assumptions are wrong. In Quo's eyes, today's national Christian leaders are being used. They did not have the same shrewdness, he suggests, that Billy Graham had in the 70s, to question whether Richard Nixon was using him solely for his appeal to religious voters. In fact, Christians who voted for Mr. Bush based on his religion may have ended up hurting the very people Jesus sought to help, the poor.
I urge the Senate to pass the faith-based initiative for the good of America.
But Quo writes that when Senator Chuck Grassley tried to rewrite Mr. Bush's $1.7 trillion tax cut to include $6 billion in tax credits for groups helping the poor, tax credits Mr. Bush himself had publicly proposed, Quo writes Bush's assistant told Grassley to drop the charity tax credits. The White House had no interest. The cuts Mr. Bush did want made things worse for charities. Quo writes that the estate tax cuts discouraged charitable giving, costing charities an estimated $5 billion. The ultimate impact of Mr. Bush's tax cuts, Quo writes, was to brutalize the very charities Mr. Bush once identified as his top priorities. After only a year, Quo writes, charitable donations were down dramatically and some charities had shut down. Quo also writes that the White House was more concerned with the appearance of doing something. He says the faith-based office wasn't even set up during the 2001 transition after the end of the Clinton administration. It was not set up until Mr. Bush took office, and Karl Rove gave a transition volunteer less than 1 week to roll out the entire faith-based initiative. The volunteer asked Rove how he should do that without a staff, without an office, without even a plan. According to Quo, quote, Rove looked at him, took a deep breath, and said, I don't know, just get me a effing faith-based thing. Got it? Unquote. After that, it was easier to push faith-based legislation rather than faith-based funding because legislation was a cheaper way to show the president was supposedly doing something. Bush assistant Margaret Spellings, now the Secretary of Education, asked Quo for legislation and said she didn't care what kind. Any kind of faith bill would do, he writes. When the office got a substantive bill backed by every senator from Santorum to Clinton, the only holdup was a green light from Josh Bolten or Andy Card. They did not get the green light. What kind of bill did get such a support? Quo writes the White House liked the issue of religious hiring, not because it was a real issue affecting real charities, but because it was divisive, and that made good politics. Tempting Faith also suggests that this Bush White House would use anything for politics. Anything.
I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians, all of them who tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
After those comments, Quo asked whether Karl Rove still wanted to let Jerry Falwell attend the national service. Even while Ground Zero was still burning, politics still mattered. Rove let Falwell attend as long as he stayed off camera. While others wept, Quo writes, Falwell laughed about something with another conservative leader. Spotting Barbara Bush, Falwell remarked on how frumpy she looked. Even choosing the new faith-based director, Jim Tuohy, was an issue of politics. Rove put out the word that for Tuohy to get the job, he had to get as many cardinals as he could to vouch for him. He did, and he got the job. Quo freely admits that he, too, is no stranger to the politics of conservative compassion. He writes he spent much of the 90s lobbying for it. But at the time, he says the top Republican donors had no interest in fighting poverty. They had other enemies in mind and told Quo they would provide lavish funding if the target was not poverty, but instead the Clintons. And Quo would know about this. By the early 90s, he was already a conservative insider, part of Jack Kemp's think tank, Empower America. To help bring about the 1994 Republican Revolution, Quo writes that he and his team taught more than 600 candidates how to run for office by blaming President Clinton for the nation's sad state of affairs at the time. Quo writes that they tried to ignore the fact that Clinton had only just started in office after 12 years of the administrations of Presidents Reagan and Bush. Together with fellow Christian Mike Gerson, now Bush's top speechwriter, Quo writes that he wrote political speeches designed to appeal to religious audiences, even when the speakers did not want to give those speeches. Jack Kemp, for one, removed religious values language from a speech he was to give to the Southern Baptist Convention. So instead, Quo writes, Gerson and Quo snuck in a few phrases that evangelicals would recognize, but lay people would not. Quo writes that it was a code that would continue to be used in speeches over the years by politicians including John Ashcroft, Ralph Reed, Bob Dole, and George W. Bush.